Rousseau calling Plato inexact and obscure is perhaps the funniest thing we're going to find in this entire book. Putting more or less people into a totalitarian body does not change the fact that it is a totalitarian body. Hello, and welcome to part 11 of my breakdown of Rousseau's Social Contract. Today we're going to be covering Book 3, Chapters 3 through 6. This is going to be a bit of a doozy, but fortunately a lot of it is just kind of definitions, and so we can get past it without too much worry. We're going to start with Book 3, Chapter 3, and the title of this chapter is The Division of Governments. Now, Rousseau starts out this chapter with a bunch of definitions. He says that the, quote, kinds or forms of government, end quote, differ primarily by the number of supreme magistrates the sovereign chooses to employ. Democracy means any system with more magistrates than non-magistrate citizens. Aristocracy is any system with fewer magistrates than non-magistrate citizens. Monarchy, Rousseau claims, may have one or up to a handful of supreme magistrates. He gives examples of the 2 kings of Sparta, and a point in the Roman Empire he claims when there were 8 emperors at the same time, yet the empire hadn't actually broken apart. These are definitions. They're mostly harmless. They're kind of part of Rousseau's part and parcel at this point of saying the things that make the most sense at the start of each of his chapters and then going on to more crazy things later on. But it's worth noting that having the most fundamental descriptor of your government be based on something this wiggly seems like a bad idea to me. Rousseau continues and goes on to note that various subdivisions within these 3 main types are also possible, with government dividing itself up into any of a variety of ways. It's almost as if those other divisions might have a fairly large effect. Well, maybe not. Who knows? Rousseau repeats that the best government has a, quote, number of supreme magistrates, end quote, but then into a new quote, kind of an ellipsis thing here, right? He's very wordy in places where he doesn't need to be wordy. So he says, quote, the number of supreme magistrates, ellipsis, is in inverse ratio to the number of citizens, end quote. Democracies for small states, aristocracies for mid-sized states, monarchies for big states. He points to his earlier deduction, which you can look at in earlier chunks of this critique, as evidence. Now, he's already said that he's immune to criticism for his stupid fuzzy math metaphors, but remember that in inverse ratio, as he states, implies that a state with 100,000 citizens should have 1/100,000th of a single magistrate. Obviously, this is not sensical, and so there's some kind of rather significant fudge factor in this calculation. And as we all know, calculations with fudge factors are to be used tentatively and not to be trusted, generally speaking. If there's a fudge factor in your math that is required to make it be right, it means that your math is not actually being derived from fundamental principles, or that there's something wrong in your derivation, and you missed a factor of 2 or 10 or 100,000 or whatever. But of course, Rousseau has already stated that, hey, I'm not responsible for any inconsistencies in my mathematical jargon. It's just there to confuse you and make you more, mentally pliable so that you can see what I'm talking about, as opposed to choosing other metaphors that might work better and actually make sense and be consistent. Rousseau chooses this route instead. This chapter is kind of basically just those definitions and his repetition of his statement about the number of supreme magistrates. There's really not much meat to this chapter, so we'll move on. Chapter 4 is called Democracy. And Rousseau starts by saying that it seems like, or it might seem like, lawmakers are best positioned to understand how to execute laws, and therefore the unity of the legislative and executive powers, which he said really can't be separated in an earlier chapter, back in Book 1. He's like, separations in government are all kind of illusory, but setting that aside, he says that it seems like unifying the legislative and executive powers might seem like a good idea. However, he contends, combining these 2 things, quote, renders the government in certain respects inadequate because things which should be distinguished are confounded, end quote. he kind of goes on to clarify, the attention of the body of the people should stay general and not get bogged down in particulars. The legislators should have a general will, or should be looking at the general will, right? Whereas the executive portion of the government needs to bring these things down into particulars and into degrees. And therefore, at least in Rousseau's framework, there's a logical reason why these two things should be separated to some degree. Rousseau goes on to say that, quote, nothing is more dangerous than the influence of private interests in public affairs, end quote. I mean, I would say that a greater danger would be the assumption by the government of unlimited power over the people, but what do I know? He goes on, quote, the abuse of the laws by government is a less evil than the corruption of the legislator, which is the inevitable sequel to a particular standpoint, end quote. Now, what he's saying here is that the government abusing the laws is less evil than the laws being bad themselves. And there's a certain amount of rationality to that. But by Rousseau's own framework, since the government is the total and unlimited creator of laws, it really can't abuse them, can it? There's an earlier chapter, whether the government can ever be wrong. And Rousseau's answer is a pretty much no, right? The government is free to change the laws at any time. He's said this earlier as well, that like, oh yeah, if the constitution of the people is not quite right, and this is an element of the laws, then, the government should seek to change the constitution and culture of the people in order to make them better people. Obviously, in any real system where laws are going to be created, at any given time, the legislator is going to be part of the government. And then, that is to say that abusing the laws by the government may be less or maybe a more evil than the corruption of the legislator himself. It depends on to what ends and to what degree this corruption happens, or this abuse happens. Rousseau's point in this chapter about democracy kind of boils down to the idea that democracy is a government for gods or angels and not men. Now, he's suggesting that gods and angels don't need to be dominated by a government in order to be good, and, fair enough. But the other thing worth noting is that supreme and unlimited power is also something only suitable for gods and angels, and not men. He's tried to kind of sidestep this problem by creating the sovereign out of some ethereal part of each person into some very real person that actually exists and has a general will. But realistically, any system that is not suitable for gods and that is not suitable for men is not suitable for men. And that's true of supreme and unlimited power, just as it's true of the way of the workings of democracy. Rousseau notes, for instance, that it's impossible to keep the people continuously assembled, to continuously, make decisions and stuff like that. And, we all know the logistical problems of pure democracy, and we all understand that, but that fact doesn't therefore justify something else, right? It's just like, yeah, this is a problem. And Rousseau is like, well, therefore we need to go in this direction and do this thing. Whereas, there might be a variety of other directions that you could go where you would get better results than what Rousseau is aiming for. It's funny because in this chapter, Rousseau kind of stumbles onto the Iron Law of Oligarchy. He says, quote, the less numerous sooner or later acquire the greatest authority, if only because they are in a position to expedite affairs, end quote. Now, to be fair, this book does predate David Ricardo and the spread of the concept of comparative advantage, so I can't really blame Rousseau for not coming up with this on his own. And Rousseau does say if only because, which means it's kind of open-ended, there might be more reasons. But it's very funny that he hasn't incorporated this thought into any of his earlier chapters, when I've been forced to harp on this Iron Law of Oligarchy to over and over and over again in his stead. It's one of those things where he has the order of things all flipped around. Like, he goes from there was one chapter in the first book where I was like, hey, some definitions, great. It's great to have these early. And now we're all the way in book 3, and he's like, here's a bunch of definitions. And it's like, this is not the place for these. These should go earlier so that people know what the hell you're talking about. But we're going to see that Rousseau's language is kind of flawed, and he's not even following his own definitions half the time. So, whatever. Let's move on. Rousseau says that the best shot at democracy is in a very small state. A state that's so small that everybody knows each other, and also a state that has very little luxury. He argues that luxury and riches corrupt the rich by possession, and the poor by covetousness. Rousseau is, of course, here pushing his kind of permanent subsistence farming idea again as kind of the way forward for mankind. Obviously, this is devastating for anyone hoping for people to have better lives someday, and also devastating for the millions and billions of people nowadays who, who building wealth upon voluntary means have created enough plenty that more people can exist and be fed. It's one of those things. It's one of those complaints that I had with Kropotkin too. Like, there's no incentive for innovation. There's no incentive for, personal accountability, and so everything's going to be kind of left at the lowest common denominator. And Rousseau is falling into the same quagmire too. He's kind of assuming that mankind is always going to be 95% farmers and 5% a few people that kind of live off the farmers, and that's it. We've seen in the last 150, 200 years that that's not the case. Then Rousseau has this weird sidetrack where he talks about someone, but I'm pretty sure he's talking about Plato. He says that Plato made virtue the basis for his republic, but he doesn't say Plato. I don't know why he doesn't do that. But then he complains that Plato was inexact and obscure, and, quote, and did not see that, the sovereign authority being everywhere the same principle should be found in every well-constituted state. In a greater or less degree, it is true, according to the form of the government. First off, Rousseau calling Plato inexact and obscure is perhaps the funniest thing we're going to find in this entire book. It's like, dude, look in a mirror, right? But it's even worse than that, because the sentence that I quoted, and I quoted it deliberately, is because that sentence is basically word salad, because the same principle, I believe, is virtue. And so therefore, that sentence reads something like this. Plato, quote, and now I'm quoting with a substitution, did not see that the sovereign authority being everywhere the same, virtue should be found in every well-constituted state. In a greater or less degree, it is true, according to the form of the government. What? That doesn't make any sense. Basically, Rousseau is saying, hey, there should be virtue present more or less depending on things. That doesn't help anyone. That doesn't provide any guidance. That's just gibberish. It would be difficult for Rousseau to be more inexact and obscure than this. Rousseau concludes this chapter by making a point about democracies and how they commonly have civil wars and what he calls intestine agitations. And that might be a typo in the version that I had, but I did do a double take and check, and it does say intestine. I thought it said intense the first time I read it, but it does say intestine. And that democracies have a tendency to change form. That's another complaint that Rousseau has. He then quotes a guy named Palatine of Poland, not Palpatine, but Palatine, who said, in Latin, I prefer liberty with danger to peace with slavery. The better question is whether or not democracy's tendencies towards civil wars and agitations are more or less justified, right? For Rousseau to quote Palatine of Poland is, I think, laughable, since Rousseau's framework has brought us nowhere so much as peace and slavery. It's a wretched populace that is completely dominated by an unlimited and all-powerful state, with not an iota of hope for wealth or comfort. Rousseau finishes chapter 4 that way, which I thought was very strange, but, whatever. He goes on in chapter 5 to discuss aristocracy. He starts by noting that the two general wills of an aristocracy are one in relation to all the citizens, the other only for members of the administration. He notes that government can have internal policies as it pleases, but must only speak to the public in the name of the sovereign. It's worth noting, and I'm emphasizing here, that Rousseau is failing his own terminology here. He already mentioned that the will of the government is called a corporate will, and here he says that this will of the aristocracy is a second general will, which goes against everything he said about the general will, and actually seems to suggest that the corporate will, or what he used to call the corporate will of an aristocracy, is a false general will, which also is a thing that should not exist. It's funny because he just defined this corporate will thing a couple chapters ago, and now he abandons it because he's like, oh, it's a second general will. It's not. It's not. And it would be better for his case if he said it wasn't, right? He'd say, remember, this is the corporate will, and it can be mistaken for the general will, but it is not the same thing, right? So, yet again, he's ignoring the power of the corporate will, or at least downplaying it, or mislabeling it, or something. But he's also, again, ignoring the inability to measure the general will, which is something that I can't harp on enough. It's if someone tells me that they have a ball that goes upward against gravity instead of downward, they're going to need to show it, right? They're going to need to provide evidence of that. In the same way, right, any government agent can simply say, this is the general will, blah, and there has to be some way to check that question, right? To say, well, is this the general will? In Rousseau's framework, there is not, because the general will is some will of a non-existent person that is pulled from part of everybody, and so it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. A system that is based on things that can't be verified is a very good way to get people in there who use the fact that things can't be verified to their own advantage. That's the whole point of Hayek's chapter in his book, The Road to Serfdom, about why the worst get on top. If the aristocracy was not speaking to the public in the name of the sovereign, how would anybody know? There's no way for them to do so. Now, despite this kind of contradictory beginning, he now goes full on into describing different kinds of aristocracies. He talks about natural aristocracies, where there's elders, right? Or people who have been recognized by the people as wise. He says that aristocracy is the method of first societies where there's kind of this cultural rule where you submit to age, wisdom, or experience, or some combination of those. This is kind of a naturalistic fallacy, which I kind of expect Rousseau to make naturalistic fallacies all over the place. And it's also worth noting that not all elders demanded 100% adoption of all their positions and opinions, right? This was, these primitive aristocracies were very much not systems where this elder claimed 100% power over everyone. This was still in a time where people could leave the tribe and go off on their own and have a chance of surviving, or maybe join another tribe, or split off with a bunch of people and say, now we're having our own tribe. There was actually a lot of fluidity back then because there was a lot more land vis-a-vis people, and so there was a lot more opportunities to go off and do your own thing if you wanted to. This is something that Locke talks about a lot as well. In fact, I think Locke does a better job of describing the inherent differences between what Locke calls paternal and political powers, and I think this is an important distinction. Maybe I'll put a link to that in the description and over in the show notes. But let's move on. Rousseau says that institutions create inequalities, which is not true, right? People are unequal just as people. And institutions can create inequalities, but there's a difference between an institution creating an inequality and an institution highlighting an inequality, right? But let's sidestep that. Rousseau says that institutions create inequalities which change aristocracy from its natural state to an elective or a hereditary aristocracy, where riches are, in the elective state, riches or power buy membership into the aristocracy. In the hereditary state, the transfer power is made from parent to child, which makes it a hereditary aristocracy. Again, definitions, but Rousseau's blame of nebulous institutions is kind of something that we need to be aware of, right? Now, he says these are the three types of aristocracy: natural, elective, hereditary. He says natural is for simple peoples, that's a quote, and that hereditary is, quote, worst of all governments. He then says in similar words that elective is best, and, quote, is aristocracy properly so called? These are more definitions. Not really much to complain about here, except he's really giving elective aristocracy a little more credit than I think it deserves. We'll get into that in a minute. Rousseau claims that in aristocracies it's much easier to assemble, discuss, and carry out the government's wishes. That's probably true. Fewer people, people maybe that are more inclined to the same direction kind of thing. Rousseau then points at the, quote, order and diligence, end quote, of, quote, venerable senators, end quote. Rousseau points, and Hayek laughs. Quote, it is the best and most natural arrangement that the wisest should govern the many, when it is assured that they will govern for its profit, and not for their own, end quote. I mean, if only there were some way to guarantee this. This is the whole problem of coercive government. How do we make a government which while maintaining its coerciveness, also does good things and doesn't encourage bad people to get in and do bad things? Well, that's the problem. That's the problem that Rousseau is ignoring. And, not necessarily without reason. Again, this is one of the things where even Locke, who was like, yeah, we should make the government the servant of the people, even Locke admitted to the necessity of taxation, conscription, dominion, prerogative, etc. These are all things that make government, not actually use real consent, but implied consent. And this is the thing that we need to watch out for, because not because necessarily there's some kind of highfalutin moral principle that we're trying to uphold. It's that when you force things onto people without their actual consent, and you tell them, no, you really consented to this, you're kind of inviting ruin upon yourself. And you can't complain when one of those people is like, puts a knife in your back and says, well, you might not be consenting to the knife in your back, but you really did, honestly, in some sense, right? That's the thing that we're trying to avoid, right? We're trying to avoid systems that encourage or create strong reasons for, interpersonal violence. And Rousseau's framework is absolutely failing at that. One point that Rousseau makes, and finally, some actual, real concrete point from Rousseau, is that you need to watch out for scattering rulers around in an aristocracy and then making each the master of a limited sphere. There's something at least. Rousseau then says that the venerableness of a senator or a member of the aristocracy provides an alternate form of preeminence for men other than riches. And he treats this as if it's a good thing. Now, I haven't read Franz Oppenheimer. I'm just going to be honest. But I have read people talking about Franz Oppenheimer. And Franz Oppenheimer was an economist and a political theorist who split up means into economic and political means. Where economic means are like, I make a voluntary trade with you. And political means are, I point a gun at someone and force him to make a trade with you against his wishes, right? He has a book called The State. I'll put a link to it in the description and in the show notes. But, the economic includes voluntary transactions and is possible, though a different, though a difficult source to become wealthy through, right? It's hard to get rich through pure economic voluntary means. The political, however, is what Rousseau is talking about here when he says that this is an alternative form of preeminence for people who want to become senators other than riches. It's basically a way for people who want power and to be worshipped, in a sense, to get that worship without having to do anything good to achieve it. Just kind of, win a popularity contest. Not the best argument here, honestly. In fact, it's much easier to become wealthy through political means. You point a gun at someone and tell him, give me all your money, and then you say, well, that's not robbery because I'm a member of the state. I'm a member of the government, and I can do that. You can't, but I can. And, don't worry about it. It's all fine. Be happy. Be happy you have a good government. It's very silly to me that we have Rousseau parading around this idea that people, by way of exercising power over others, get this preeminence, and he doesn't see the possible downsides of this. He's just like, well, we just need to make sure that everything's good. And it's like, well, that's the problem, dude. That's why we're reading your book. We want to know what you have to say about how to fix these problems, these persistent issues that we have in governments. And, he's like, oh, but just make it good. It's like, thanks. Anyway, that's how he finishes out chapter 5 here. Now he's going on to chapter 6, monarchy. Now, it's weird because he says that the elective aristocracy is the best form of government, but he spends the most time on monarchy. And, he spends a lot of time telling us things we've already know. I'll kind of summarize, or things that we might expect as pretty obvious. Number 1, unitary government. It's the most active, it's the least plagued with internal conflict. He's kind of said things like this before, right? There is no difference between the individual and the corporate will of government in a monarchy. And, then he repeats that it's also the most affected by individual wills. This is obvious. This is, again, Rousseau putting obvious stuff at the start of the chapter so that you kind of get lulled into a false sense of security. He makes some good points here, actually. He talks about Machiavelli. He says that kings desire to be absolute, but the love of the people is too precarious a foundation for their power to remain absolute. By doing bad things, they can extinguish the love of the people. Therefore, it is natural for kings to prefer a subjugated, weakened people that will tolerate their wickedness. It's worth noting that Rousseau's framework also aims at a completely helpless, subjugated people. We saw that in an earlier chapter, back in Book 2, I believe. Rousseau says that monarchy suits a large state, where class differences of a small nobility or court are not as destructive. It's kind of we can get away with this principle, which I think is not a very good principle. But he continues. Another major problem with monarchy is that those who arise to positions of privilege in a monarchy, a court, people who are part of the court, right? Like the court in the king's court is in session kind of sense, right? That these people are often, quote, petty blunderers, petty swindlers, and petty intriguers, end quote. Rousseau says that such petty officials are rare in, quote, republican government, end quote. It's worth noting that Rousseau has stated that any system that follows his ideas is a republic because he likes the word republic. And so you can have a monarchy that's a republic. He says that explicitly in an earlier chapter. And so now he's differentiating a monarchy from republican government when his own terms don't permit him to do that. He does this a lot, where he kind of lapses into words that sound good without remembering that he's redefined them into a complete slop of nonsense. And it's also worth noting that in this point where he's talking about all these petty officials, that Rousseau forgot wheedlers. And wheedlers are, of course, someone who is very dangerous in a monarchy. The guy who keeps telling the king, yeah, you're right, yeah, you're right, yeah, you're right, yeah, you're right. Whereas what we really need is the guy who says, remember you're mortal, remember you're mortal, remember you're mortal. Now, Rousseau continues. He says that the size of the state should vary with the ability of the king, but that this is impossible to maintain, that a good king should have a big state, and a bad king should have a smaller state. He says, therefore, that a senate, or some group of representative aristocracy, has more constant abilities and therefore suits a state of relatively consistent size well. If these borders are sitting here, then, you have 100 senators, and they move in and out, but their overall total power level doesn't change that much. It's like a weird political Dragon Ball Z kind of principle. He's using this metaphorical idea of power as if it's some kind of fluid, kind of like the old, what do they call it, caloric stuff that they had for heat is actually a liquid called caloric. And if you have a horse run a thing with friction, then caloric gets into the water and it makes the water hotter, kind of thing, right? While there is an effect that a charismatic ruler can have in getting others to agree to obey him, at least temporarily, this isn't really a voluntary transaction in a true sense, because there's that kind of hidden threat of violence behind it, right? The whole point that I'm trying to make in my kind of voluntarist critiques of these pieces is that working from a basis of what the people agree upon is probably a far better gauge of the workable size and appropriate size of a government, assuming that the government has to be some kind of coercive or non-coercive body that makes decisions, right? I'm using government in the wider sense. Then, once we have an idea of what people agree upon, if the government limits itself to those issues on which there's essentially common agreement, that nobody was really like, well, this is 100% wrong kind of thing. Anything else, you have the government focus on places where there's agreement. If everybody in this particular area, right, believes that that Q basic is the best thing that people should learn in 6th grade, right? Then the government can say, we're going to have people learn Q basic in 6th grade in the public schools, right? And it would have, let's say it has 99% approval, right? That 1% of people is likely to have enough social pressure on them that they're not going to pick up a gun and shoot somebody, right? Over Q basic in 6th grade. But if you take people who say that, meat is murder, and people who say, I got to have a steak every single day, and then you have the government force steak into the people who think meat is murder, then you have a problem. You have these people who are being forced into a certain position, and a significant chunk of them, where they have a very strong moral approbation against the action that they're being forced to take. And number two, they're being told that this action is right and that they're wrong for having a conscience that points against it. But they're not being given an argument. They're just having a gun pointed at them and say, "Eat your steak," right? It's not, you could understand why a person who's being forced to eat steak when he thinks that meat is murder might say, well, if meat isn't murder, then maybe some other things aren't murder, right? That's the point, right? That's what we're trying to get away from. We're trying to get away from systems where there's someone who feels, like a rational person, like a rational, good chunk of the people think this is so bad that I would rather, do X, Y, Z than simply knuckle under to it, right? That's what we're trying to create systems that doesn't do, right? And so, this is why I talk more about voluntarism than I talk about anarchism, because there's going to be people who want to be part of a socialist commune. And it's not up to us to tell them socialist communes are coercive. It's up to them to come up with a series of agreements that give them, whatever kind of stability they want, within the confines of voluntary agreements, right? If you get 100 people together and they all are ardent communists, then let them run a commune. We don't need to go to war to stop them from running a commune. Anyway, Rousseau continues by talking about how the need for unbroken rule in a monarchy of a single person, or, pretty much unbroken rule of a single person, then another person immediately afterwards, as a serial rulers, right, is another weakness of monarchy and often leads to bad rulers, right? Instead of waiting a few minutes to determine whether this young guy is actually going to be a good king or not, it's just his, right? And, whether he's good or bad, you're just kind of screwed. He talks about how the ability of regents to operate and the ability to teach young princes to rule well, these both have horrible consistency. It's worth noting that at this point, the weaknesses of monarchy seem to loom over any potential strengths. I mean, gotcha, but I understand, but you're still offering this as a potentially useful method for people to operate. And this is still not anything like a Hoppian monarchy where the monarch actually owns the land and says, hey, yeah, I'll rent you land, but I do own it, and so, I'm going to try to make sure that everybody remains, I think there are points to argue about Hoppian monarchism, or what people call Hoppian monarchism, because Hoppe himself says he's not a monarchist, but at the same time, a lot of people read Democracy, the God That Failed, and kind of got the very boring midwit idea that, monarchy is better than democracy because of these particular issues that Hoppe brings up in, these limited issues in which monarchy does succeed over democracy. But anyway, Rousseau actually makes a really strange point next. He talks about how there's this inconsistency from generation to generation because there's a very strong tendency for, we'll call it regime N+1, to take opposite positions in a bunch of places to regime N. So, King Bobby II has all these policies. Then King Bobby III, takes power, and his goal is to reverse all the policies of King Bobby II. It's not actually true, and it's not actually a thing that happens a lot. There are certainly differences of opinion that show up, but generally speaking, these are in limited areas of policy and not broad strokes of, because for a monarch to change policies 100%, 180 degrees, would be to say, let's abolish the monarchy, and that's obviously not what Rousseau's talking about. Rousseau notes that a, quote, king by nature, end quote, as described by Plato, Rousseau is quoting Plato, is so rare that it makes monarchy a bad gamble. He says that simply telling the people that bad kings are kind of elements or instruments of the wrath of God, you've been bad, that's why you have a bad king, and just, be better and wait for a good king, doesn't really solve the problem, and I agree with him there. He has this metaphor about a doctor who says, I have this miracle cure, and he administers the miracle cure, and it doesn't do anything, and he just says, well, just be patient, right? Well, no, I want someone to, fix the illness that I have. I don't want someone to tell me, here's a fix, and now just be patient. And, there's limits to that too, where it's like, well, it takes an hour for it to take effect. Okay, fine. It takes a day for it to take effect. Okay, probably fine. It takes a month for it to have an effect. Well, I mean, should I try something else during this 1 month period? No. Just me. Just me. Trust me. No, it takes 10 years for it to have an effect. Well, you see, I'm choking on my own lung fluids. I really need something sooner than that, right? But the point that Rousseau is making here about having it be difficult to find kings by nature is true for senators too, right? Wouldn't it make more sense to reduce the dependency of the populace upon these extremely shaky grounds? I say yes, but Rousseau says no, because his framework demands an absolute, supreme state. And, the point that I seem to be getting out of this is that his arguments in favor of it are pretty bad, and he even argues against it in a lot of cases. He just kind of sidesteps all the parts where he could argue against it. Anyway, that's what we've got for this week, part 11, book 3, chapters 3 through 6, Rousseau's Social Contract. He's talking about the different forms of government, he's talking about the 3 broad strokes, and he's just not making a lot of sense. He's contradicting his own definitions. He's providing definitions that contradict his earlier definitions. He's using language in sloppy ways. He's using more fuzzy math. And then he spends barely a page talking about aristocracy, which he claims is the best government, and then like 3.5 pages talking about monarchy, which he claims is often broken and usually a bad gamble. And he's not even really talking about it for most of its time, talking about the bad points of it. Those just come up at the very end as like, oh, by the way, right? Anyway, that's what I've got for you on Rousseau for this week. Hope you have a good rest of your week, and I will see you next time. As always, there will be links in the description, which will include a link to my blog where there's a PDF with full show notes and, things that you can do to support the channel if you feel like it. So as always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and have a good week. See you later.